Shadow of the Erdtree introduced us to many new enemies, as well as a land forgotten by those who lived under the rule of the Golden Order, thanks to Marika's Veil. While the Land of Shadow is a unique landscape with its own rich history that harkens back to a time well before the demigod's rule, we can still find echoes of the base game of Elden Ring through our journey. Some of these are blatant, like the truth behind Miquella and St. Trina, but others are more subtle. As we learn of Marika's past, and by extension that of her people, the shamans, we learn of the horrifying atrocities they were forced to endure. Their flesh melded harmoniously with others, and this aspect of their being was needed by the Hornsent in order for them to pursue godhood. So it was that the shaman were carved to pieces and stuffed inside jars, as was their lot in life under Hornsent rule. But what I want to focus on isn't the ritual itself, but the people performing the ritual. These men were known as Potentates, and if you follow the story of our little friend Jarbairn, you know this title means something completely different in the Lands Between. So let's discuss who the Potentates were in the Land of Shadow, and speculate on why that title was given to those who protect the jars in the Lands Between. Welcome back to Elden Lore, our continuing series diving into the lore of the people, places, and practices of the Lands Between and the Land of Shadow. Whether this is your first time finding the channel thanks to renewed interest in Elden Ring, thanks to the Tarnished Edition, or you've been with us from the start, thank you for choosing to spend some time with us. Be sure to leave any questions you have about the lore of this world in the comments, because we monitor them closely, respond as often as possible, and even make videos based on viewer questions if we find there's enough to talk about. We also have a Discord where our community talks about all things FromSoft, especially the new games they have on the horizon. If you end up liking our content, please consider subscribing to the channel. It goes a very long way in keeping us relevant in YouTube's algorithm, and it seems we've lost some of that relevancy as of late. Even so, no pressure, because it's not about the subs to us. Your viewership is always more than enough. With that said, let's take a look at what exactly a potentate is, and what that means between these two worlds. The Greater Potentates are enemies found while exploring the Bonnie village in the Land of Shadow. They each wear the caterpillar mask and nothing else, likely as part of their ritual murders. This item is a grotesque mask constructed from countless solidified caterpillars, a ritual implement of the Greater Potentates of Bonnie Village, used to ward off thoughts of impurity, doubt, temptation, and other wickedness one is vulnerable to while absorbed in divine ritual. This mask is also famously worn by Hornsent, but I don't believe this means he was among the Potentates, particularly because he does not share their affinity for large butchering knives, instead focusing on slim blades that allow him to attack with speed. He would have needed this mask to focus on his goal, to keep doubt from his mind as he pursued Mesmer the Impaler. The Bonnie Butchering Knife is a weapon of the Greater Potentates of Bonnie Village, an outside butcher's cleaver used to dismember human bodies in the making of the great jars stored in the jails. The Bonnie Village is overflowing with these jars, and it was the job of the Potentates to cleave the shaman limb from limb and add them to these jars, so that their flesh would meld as part of their rituals. Every one of the jar-inert enemies we face is an amalgamation of shaman parts, stuffed within the jars by the Greater Potentates. As far as we know, only one potentate escaped his role as a butcher, and went on to write cookbooks for different ways we can utilize jars. All the Greater Potentates cookbooks tell us they are a record of crafting techniques of the Greater Potentates who roam the lands near and far. Haunted by the grotesque practice of his village of birth, he stuffed great pots with all manner of things. So while he escaped a life of stuffing living, breathing people into jars, he still found ways to use his skills to create, essentially, projectile weapons. So we know the Potentates of the Land of Shadow were religious fanatics who needed to literally cover their faces in order to stomach their work. But why were they stuffing people into jars? Upon killing the jar innards, we have a chance of acquiring innard meat, which tells us this is what becomes of the condemned, who get sliced up and stuffed into jars to become saints instead. The ghost at the whipping hut also refers to shamans being granted sainthood by being stuffed into jars. So this ritual was likely intended to create a saint who could lead their people through the divine gate. Some even believe Queen Marika herself was the only successful jar saint, but I'm not completely convinced of this. We now have a solid understanding of who the greater potentates are and why they hack and slash the bodies of shamans and stuff them into jars. But what does that have to do with the idea of a potentate that were presented in the base game of Elden Ring? Upon meeting Jarbaern, he asks us if we're going to be the new potentate of Jarburg, and offers to take a look at our hands. After seeing how rough they are, Jarbaern tells us a potentate needs to have slick, slidey hands, which is deeply counterintuitive to what Shadow of the Erdtree showed us of the potentates. In fact, it's Diallo's Hoslow who comes to be the new potentate of Jarburg, telling Jarbaern he will care for the jars, but won't fight because he is a coward. He does betray this notion by fighting off the jar poachers at the cost of his own life, his soft hands finally winning a true battle, and inspiring Jarbaern to set out on his quest as a warrior jar, adopting his catchphrase, "The tale of House Hoslow is told in blood." So here we have a potentate that is essentially the polar opposite of what the potentates were originally meant to be. Not a murderous butcher, stuffing jars full of innards, but a gentle protector, doing his best to watch over and polish the living jars that don't seem to contain living, melded flesh. In order to understand why this title reflects two completely different groups of people, I think it's important to call out the difference between the jars in the Land of Shadow and the lands between. In the Land of Shadow, shamans were torn limb from limb and stuffed into jars, having their flesh melded together and eventually bringing new life from inside their prison. In the lands between, the living jars don't deal in living flesh. They collect the remains of the dead in order to make themselves stronger. They don't do this to grow a new amalgam of life within their jar. They themselves are alive. The flesh within is simply a source of power. It seems ludicrous that Marika would bring this practice of filling jars from the Land of Shadow to the lands between, when you consider how many of her people must have been subjected to this horrific practice. But perhaps she wished to take back this torturous ritual, instead making it a part of her cycle. This is more theory than anything else, but if you look at the minor Erdtrees, they're often surrounded by broken or cracked jars. And I don't think it's a big leap to assume that most living jars were meant to end up beneath a tree sooner or later. Instead of being filled with living flesh to birth a saint, these jars were sent out to collect the remains of the dead in order to bring them and their spirits to the Erdtree. This would keep the cycle of spiritual death and rebirth moving. This does not account for warrior jars like Alexander and Jarbaern, but they seem to be the exception rather than the rule. Even the warrior jars don't seem to attack humans unprovoked. They instead seek out the remains of great warriors and add them to their own innards so that they might become stronger. In this way, I believe Marika took a symbol of oppression and twisted it to her own ends, making what was once a horrifying sentence for her people and modifying it to keep herself in power. So with the jars now serving a significantly less violent purpose, they needed people to shepherd them along in their duties and make sure no harm came to them as they reached their destinations. This is where I believe the new potentates would come in. The jars have always been, and continue to be, religious implements. But in Marika's new world, they would be treated with a kindness that their previous iteration was not. Before the Shattering, the dead were respected, because they were part of the divine cycle of the Erdtree. So those that walked with the jars were not warriors, but soft-handed attendants. The title of potentate was subverted, taken from something deeply violent to something more tender in order to bury the past, as Marika often did. These new potentates were meant to serve the jars in a way, rub them down, keep them in good working order so they might fulfill their purpose. Perhaps keeping the practice of jars carrying flesh and reinterpreting it as a respect for the dead rather than a horror for the living was a way for Marika to cope with the terrible practices her people endured, and a show of respect for the shamans, taking a fate they had thrust upon them by the Hornsent, and fundamentally changing it into something she believed maintained a world of prosperity for all. We can't know for sure why the practice of creating living jars was brought to the lands between, but I like to think of it as an example of the abused taking back their agency, and maybe even a middle finger to those who oppressed them before their rise to power. It seems to me like the kind of thing Marika would do, taking the title of Potentate, which was steeped in blood, and instead making them the protectors of jars, rather than the people filling them. Thank you for joining us as we explore the Potentates of the Land of Shadow and the lands between. Do you have any thoughts on our theories here? Why do you think Marika kept the term Potentate when creating her rule in the lands between? Is Anastasia Tarnished Eater in any way tied to the Potentates of the Land of Shadow, given that she wields an identical cleaver? Was this much thought even given to reusing the title of Potentate, or am I just going crazy? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Watch that button light up as I ask you to like this video. And don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell, and set notifications to all, so you never miss out on any of our lore dives. We look forward to seeing you again for more Elden Lore.